Hi, hello. So let's get the party started. Today we are lucky to hear Tomasz Trzciński at our eDrone seminar. He will tell us a bit about continual learning. This is a topic of utmost importance for many production machine learning systems. Tomek's CV is long and impressive, so I just cherry-picked a few items. He's a chief scientist and co-owner at Tooploox. He's assistant professor at Warsaw University of Technology and Jagiellonian University. And his professional appointments include work with Google, Qualcomm, and he was also appointed a visiting scholar at Stanford University, many others. So I guess in short, he's a human mixture of experts. And I guess what impresses me the most about Tomek is this very rare but extremely powerful combination of a scientist and a business person. And Tomek gave me some very valuable feedback when we were building the AVA team back in 2020. So thank you for that, Tomek, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, I cannot say enough about being grateful to be part of this webinar, and thanks so much, Piotr, for the warm introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. I hope that you will enjoy this talk. So let me maybe just start by saying that continual learning is a very vivid and active area of research, both in academia and in industry. And the way that I would like to propose to look at this problem is from a generative perspective. So not necessarily to look at the continual learning as a discriminative or a supervised problem, but to look from the generative models, which I will introduce in this talk. So with no further ado, let me just start with explaining a little bit more about, well, what machine learning models do and what continual learning is, or how it is defined. So, and well, it's classical, I can say right now, approach for machine learning models. You would have some data with labels, like in this case, the images with airplane and automobile labels. And you would like to train those so that at inference, if you receive an image, you would get an appropriate label. And you can take images as a sample data type, and it can also apply to text or audio or any other data type. Now, let's say that you have your model trained for distinguishing airplanes from automobiles, and now you want to train it again for distinguishing between two other classes, such as birds and cats. Now, what you would usually do, and that's what has been done so far in academia and in industry, is retrain your model. This is something that fairly well, experienced researchers call transfer learning, or you probably played a little bit with ImageNet, ResNets that were trained on ImageNet, a big chunk of data, and then just cutting the last layer of your network and then applying or retraining it for another purpose. Now, if you do that, you'd get pretty good performance on the images, on the data that you recently trained your model, like cat, that I'm sure you would find very powerful. But when you get to test the previous data sample, like the planes, the neural network would most likely be somehow stumbled, and it will ideally or most likely give you some weird results that you would not most likely expect. In other words, you would see some sort of forgetting of neural network. And to reiterate that, for MNIST data set, which is, I guess, the most classical approach or the most classical problem in computer vision that you came across, you have a bunch of images of well, letters, and what you would see in your training process is, epoch by epoch, iteration by iteration. This is the x-axis. You would see the training accuracy increased. So you would find this increasing precision of your classifier. And then, as per the meme on the left, you would keep on stirring this data, this pile of data, until it starts to look right. you would just add more data and then add more iterations, propagate the gradients. And then at the end, you would get something close to 1, which is what usually people do when they see a missed data set. Now, let's assume something different. Let's assume that the network does not see all the images at once. It sees the tasks. So it sees basically in the first task, the distinction between like 2 classes, and it needs to learn how to discriminate between 0 and 1, then between 2 and 3, 4 and 5, 6 and 7, and 8 and 9. This is what you would actually observe in when you try to play this different game. You would see that for the task number 1, you would obtain the precision on your training quickly, well, close to 1. It's a simple task. But once you start training the same network for the second task, the performance on the first one would drop significantly. And then similar things would happen for the next ones. This is called catastrophic forgetting. I guess, you know, catastrophic helps to emphasize how big of a problem it is. And it's defined as an abrupt performance loss on previously learned tasks when acquiring new knowledge. So when training on new data sets, or when training on new tasks. What the usual reasoning behind catastrophic forgetting is that the stationary data distribution is something that neural networks assume in classical approach. So in other words, they see the data set and they assume that this data set will not change in time. The distribution of the data into classes will remain constant. Another assumption that classical or standard supervised approaches make is that they observe a representative sample of the world around them. So if you see, you know, ImageNet, one of the reasons why it's such a powerful data set and everybody loves it is that it provides a representative samples of objects throughout the world, from, you know, dogs, cats to more complex objects, cars, aeroplanes, and so on. In practice, however, this is rarely met, this requirement about stationary characteristics of data. So people usually add new data, and then what they use, what they do in practice is they retrain the entire model from scratch. So if you increase your data sets one by one, you know, sample by sample, or after a few days, what you'd usually do is you would take this bigger data set and you would retrain the entire model from scratch. This obviously leads to a significant computational and storage costs, because you need to store the previous data set, and you would need to, you know, extrapolate with a growing amount of data, and then you would need to store that more and more. But also what is quite well recently observed by many researchers around the world with heavy GPU usage, it leads to increased carbon footprint, and other, you know, relevant ecological issues arise. So in other words, this catastrophic forgetting phenomenon is not just a peculiarity of a neural network, but it has a significant practical implications. This is where continual learning, or other names such as lifelong or sequential or incremental learning are used, comes with some form of help. It's actually the main objective of continual learning as a domain of machine learning is train models or propose methods that need to adapt to ever-changing conditions, such as new data distributions or increasing number of tasks. So in other words, you assume that you would like to reuse your previously acquired knowledge. It's not there for just to train your model and then well, get rid of this. You want to reuse it and get your model better with the next iterations. The data in this paradigm is considered a continuous stream and not an ordered set. So in classical approaches, you would construct your data set, you would keep it in your storage, and you would think about this as an ordered set with labels and so on. Here you consider this as a stream. It's coming, you can buffer it up somehow, but it's a stream, it's not constant. Now, what actually inspires me personally to look at this problem is that very similar behaviors are expected in living creatures. Like for instance, here is a short video of a toddler learning to play with toys. And it's not like you give a toddler instructions about the data set of toys that he or she, well, it's probably he because of the blue thing, but I guess that there are other options here as well. The baby discovers all the things around, even those that are not actually toys per se. And that's something that probably every parent would discover in his or her life as well, that kids consider toys not just those objects that we label as toys, but pretty much anything can be a toy. So in other words, as living creatures, we continually learn our our model of surrounding world, and we learn how to play with the objects. We learn how to identify them and how to work out their details. This approach, or this type of machine learning problems, as mentioned before, it has a severe or significant implications in real life applications. For instance, in robotics, you would find not only Boston Dynamics, but many other robots to encounter new things as they explore, as they browse through new spaces. You would find more data that probably wasn't available to you when you were working on your robot in your lab. My group at the Warsaw University of Technology, we work with physicists at CERN in high energy physics experiments, where experiments are done in those detectors that you see in the central image. So these are like very complex. You can think about them as cameras, but made of electromagnetic detection plates. And the conditions that appear, or conditions that you observe inside those detectors, they vary in time. So you can start with a certain temperature, certain pressure, but over time it changes. And for high energy physics experiments, which are often, or pretty much all over the time, focused on hitting or colliding two beams of high speed protons or electrons, those tiny little differences in the environment can significantly impact the results. So in other words, you would not be able to detect, boson, Higgs boson, and if you don't understand what kind of current situation in the detector is, and you need to adapt. Another application is autonomous driving, which is, again, the same sort of a problem. You see conditions that are changing, like vegetation. Trees have leaves in the spring and in the summer, but in autumn, then they start to disappear, change colors, and you need to adapt. You need to learn how to navigate, even when you don't see the same, or you don't record the same images. So how do people deal with those problems? How do people deal with those sort of challenges in real life? So as I mentioned before, the easiest trick would be to retrain the model. But again, this is very computationally heavy. This is something that you would not like to do if not necessary. The lifelong or continual learning approaches can be split into 4 groups. One of them is regularization. The second one is the modification of architecture of your network. The third one, and actually sort of linked with the fourth, or some people actually think about it as a one, is rehearsal. So repeating the data from the past to make sure that your model is fit for this. or generative replay, which is in fact replaying the data from the past, but not from a memory buffer, but using generative models. And let me maybe briefly go through those approaches so that you get a bit of an intuition of how they work. So regularization. The idea behind regularization is pretty simple. When you learn new data, when you learn new tasks, you slow down updating the weights. So you basically reduce the update of the weights that are relevant for the previous tasks. So if you train something for cat versus dog detection, and now you want to train it for airplane versus car, you make sure that you understand which weights are relevant for the first task, and you don't touch them that much. This allows you to slow down the catastrophic forgetting, just because you stay attached to those weights of your neurons that are relevant for a given task, but it doesn't eliminate the problem. It just slows it down, so you are able to train maybe more tasks. The downside of this approach is that it increases computational cost, because you start to add more constraints to the optimization. You keep on adding with the increasing number of tasks, yet another regularization term in your cost function, or you observe more points, and you make sure that it doesn't go under those, or go outside of those bounds that feel acceptable for a given task. The second group of approaches is architectural modifications. So this boils down to modifying the architecture of your network, for instance, by selecting a component, a subset of your connections in your neural network that are used for a given task. So let's say that you have a humongous neural network with, I don't know, 50 million parameters, and the first task only uses 2 million of them. So your task here is to identify which component of your network, which part of your network is relevant for a given task. The limitations of this family of solutions is that it requires you to know which task you're in, so which batch of data you're currently looking at, so that you know which module or which component of your network has to be used in a given moment. If it's not available, if you don't have this index, then you need to come up with some heuristics. You need to define, outputs of your network, compare it with those that you associate with a given task. In other words, you need to sort of fix for this missing information. And another downside is that you have to be able to create a model that is much bigger than what you really need. The redundancy is the price that you need to pay. So you need to have something that is much bigger. The number of parameters is much higher than what you actually require to solve a specific given task. The third group of approaches, and that's something that is very well linked with the last one, is the rehearsal, and it has some biological inspirations. So at that point, taking my previous slides into account, we look at the biology of how living creatures, how humans learn, and how they fundamentally, I would say, store the knowledge that they learn at school and with their lives. And here the inspiration comes from those mechanisms for acquiring knowledge that is fairly common across living organisms, not just humans. Sleep is a fairly important mechanism for consolidating knowledge, according to neuroscientists. And those recent works in neuroscience indicate that one of the functions of sleep, on top of just getting us relaxed and storing or preparing for the next day of work, is to rehearse past knowledge. So to sort of remind yourself about what happened during the last day, week, and so. Especially important part of this sleeping pattern is dreaming. If you still get to dream, then that means that your brain is still very sensitive for new information. As a kid, you probably dreamt much more. That's a fairly usual phenomenon as well, because you were learning so much. All the things were new. You wanted to rehearse what you learned in your previous week at school and with friends and so on, so that your brain was able to reorganize the existing neural connections. And that's the inspiration that machine learning researchers used to propose methods that are linked to rehearsal. So in this case, we look at the rehearsal from the memory buffer perspective, which means that you simply store some selected samples from the past in your memory, like what you do when you're memorizing a book or taking photos and so on. You take those data samples and you store them in memory. Now, when you learn new things, and in that case, when you sleep, you replay those samples from the past. And in machine learning methods, what you do is when you train a new model, you take a few samples from your current task and you replay the sample of your past data from the memory. The obvious limitation that I guess everyone can identify straight away is that the memory buffer gets increased with every single data sample that you store. And this is a linear increase of memory requirements. You have more samples to store, you have more memory that it takes. Yeah, if you don't have your water, just make sure that you drink as much as possible. It's super hot, at least over here in Warsaw, I guess, in Krakow, wherever you're coming from, it's pretty much similar. So make sure you hydrate yourself. All right, so what people think about when they look at the problem of increasing the memory buffer is that we have those recent discoveries in machine learning, which are generative models. And what they have as a paramount, or what they have as the most important feature, is that they're able to generate new samples from noise or learned from the samples coming from a predefined probability distribution. So the idea is that you have some data that you train your generative model, and it can be used to generate more. Now, the research hypothesis that we follow in our current work, and this is why the title of this talk is Deep Generative View on Continual Learning, is that generative models are more robust to catastrophic forgetting, since their goal is to represent the data. So to represent the data set that it's shown, and not to discriminate between instances. So in other words, if you have a problem of cat versus dog, then your model focuses on the differences between those models, or differences between those classes. So obviously, if you show them another problem, there will be a different parts of data, different elements that would be relevant for this additional task. Now, for generative models, the objective is different. What do you want to find? What you want to create is a model that is able to represent your class and then regenerate more samples from a noise distribution that follows this probability prior that your data set you trained your data set from. So we have fairly fairly successful discoveries in those recent years related to generative models. You probably have heard about GANs. I will just say a few words about those in a second. You probably have heard about variational autoencoders. These are not as well known and I guess not that demonized as GANs, but still fairly powerful generative models. And the way that people usually learn about GANs is through deep fakes or through this person does not exist.com, where you can create an image, fairly high quality image actually, of people that do not exist, which is again a fairly useful application if you don't want to break any GDPR or RODO, I think in Poland for the privacy issues. But overall, it feels a little bit edgy for people to think that there are some models that are able to create folks that do not exist. But there are some useful applications of generative models as well. But let's dig into a little bit, maybe not even dig into it, scratch a surface of generative models. So you would have the generative adversarial networks. These are the I think most famous generative models right now, where you have two networks that have adversarial objectives. The generator has a goal, or its objective is to generate data that is similar to the original samples that you feed into your network. And then there is a discriminator, D. So the generator is G, the discriminator is D. And the discriminator's goal is to detect, to differentiate between original data, the X real, and the fake data, X fake. And now, since they are trained in an iterative manner, so you first train a little bit the generator, then you train the discriminator, and then you iterate between those two. It's getting to the point where you find this optimal saddle point of your objective function, and you are able to generate, disconnect the discriminator and generate more realistically looking samples from your Z noise latent space. Now, problem with GANs is usually that they are fairly difficult to train because of this iterative process, but people use them anyways, and they are fairly powerful and well known across the community. Another group that is a little bit more, I would say, predictable is a type of generative models that are based on variational autoencoder. Here, the main objective is a little bit more straightforward, I would say. So the idea is that you want to reconstruct the input data as the output, while constraining your intermediate latent space to follow a specific distribution. So you want to go from X input to X prime reconstructed input. Ideally, they should be identical through an encoder and decoder network. And in the Z or Z in the latent space, you would like to enforce some distribution. You would like to make sure that the Z latent follows a Gaussian distribution usually, so that with adversarial trainings, you can also ask the network to, or optimize the network to follow other distributions, but it's usually Gaussian distribution. So then when you sample from the Z latent space, you can use the decoder and create more samples for your reconstructed input. And that's the generative ability of your VAE. It can also be seen as a compression problem, where you just compress your input into a smaller dimensional space of Z. But overall, this is also fairly well known generative model. And now, as I said, people usually find out about generative models from this demonizing, deep fake video online or broadcast, video on YouTube, where you see a fairly problematic use cases of generative models. And I remember when actually this whole deepfake craziness started, we were at NeurIPS in I think it was one of those NeurIPS where it was hot. So it was LA or Long Beach, I think. And then the paper was about deep faking Obama, and people were asking, like, what are, do you have any moral constraints as the researchers? And Is there any threats that you see in this technology? You know, this is asked to a PhD student who is so happy that he got his paper accepted to the conference that he doesn't really care that much about, you know, all those political or moral issues. And the usual answer, which he definitely memorized very well, is that our goal is to define the model and publish them so that at least people know what they're fighting against, which is a fairly common way of defending this kind of research. But yet again, it's not as straightforward from a research perspective as it is from a human being perspective. So beware. Now, at Tooploox and in Warsaw, at Warsaw University of Technology, we don't go that far. We actually try to use generative models for good reason, for good cause. If you let me use this phrasing. And these are a few of papers that we published in the last few years at well, major conferences and major venues. So we use GANs for creating compact representations of images. We used the GANs for privatizing sensitive medical data. This is actually a work done in collaboration with Stanford researchers. We generated 3D point cloud meshes using GAN. So for autonomous driving, you have quite a bit of a challenge with creating, well, registering 3D points, understanding what lidars give you as 3D points, but also that put that in a mesh perspective, so into a visualization of an object. And we are able to use hyper network with well, generative model to create those meshes. And also, as mentioned in the few slides back, we are fairly fond of the applications of generative models for speeding up simulations of beam collisions in CERN. So usually people would use Monte Carlo simulations. And what it seems to be working fairly well is instead of going through those multiple iterations of Monte Carlo testing, you can speed that up with generative models. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about generative models that are, again, powerful and fairly well, recently introduced, I can maybe show you a few examples or give you an intuition behind generative replay. So you remember the rehearsal part where we replaying data from the past. Now, what when we change this memory buffer and we use generative models to train or to be able to generate those past samples when trained on past data. In other words, instead of just keeping this memory buffer full of images, you keep the weights of your generative models, you train it for a given batch of data for a given task. And then in the next task, you replay the past data from your generative model. It's fairly exciting perspective for me personally, because I was quite fond of generative models in the past, but also because, first of all, memory buffer is not growing that much. Of course, you need more and more memory to store your generative models, but looking at the infinite perspective, these are much more compact, especially if your data batches are of significant sizes, and then storing the memory, the data itself. They're also leveraging recent breakthroughs in generative models. So this is one of the hottest topic in the recent years, which means that you can fairly easily leverage all the new things that pop up in this area to solve the continual learning problem. And finally, it's inspired by memory consolidation in human brain. The reason is that how memory is consolidated, according to neuroscientists, is partially by replaying past data and partially by building the representation. So by being able to, when you see 5 chairs, you are able to draw another chair. You will be able to to understand what a chair means. You're building internally your representation of an object called chair, so that when you're in a new place, you don't just associate the image of a chair with your past experiences with the chair, but you map it into some intrinsic representation of how chair looks like, and then you know that if you sit on this chair, you will not fall down. Unless you're in the modern art museum where people tend to create chairs that are not chairs, or they're a piece of art. Okay, so what are the limitations of generative replay that we encountered when we got into this field? Like, we were not the first ones to discover that generative models are fairly useful to solve continual learning. But these were the problems that we found and inspiration for our work. So first of all, we discovered that there is a class or batch overlap within the latent space of your generative models. So if you encode your images into a single latent space, so let's say that you have a batch and you trained your generative model, the next batch comes, the next batch of data comes, and you want to retrain your generative model so that it also creates some representation of your new batch. What you would quickly discover is that those images or this data in your latent space start to overlap with each other. And then if the classes, or if the objects from multiple classes live close by in your latent space, it leads to the confusion. So if you learn how to generate, for instance, cars and horses, as in this image, and you see that, especially in variational autoencoder, those two objects live close by, then what you would be able to generate are the images that are quite well smooth out or well noisy, and they have very few high definition edges and high definition elements, and they kind of merge together. The reason for this is that they live in very close proximity in your continuous latent space. And this is why we proposed well, two methods actually. First, binplay, and then multi-band variational autoencoder to address the limitations of currently used generative rehearsal methods. So binplay is a part of generative replay family. It uses binary latent space to store codes of rehearsed examples, and it allows efficient memory memorization of those samples without the risk of overlapping between the class. This is an overview of how it works, and I will go through the details, but overall you have, say, images from a green batch. You encode them into some green codes, and you have the previous codes in a different part of your binary latent space. You still have the future code space allocated for the future batches, but then the decoder comes in and it is able to decode both the previous codes and the current codes for your data samples. And then you feed this to your continually trained network. It can be a discriminative network or any other network, and that's how it works overall intuitively. So in more details, when a new batch of size 3 comes in, you have a frog and 2 horses. What you do is you pre-calculate binary codes for 3 new objects. And to do this, we use well, the function proposed by us that uses a exponential and creates 3 binary codes. Here, those binary codes are not assigned to those 3 data samples yet, but in the second stage, you optimize your encoder decoder. So you train your encoder decoder architecture to fit the elements of your data to the most optimal codes. And the reason why you, for instance, picked those codes together is that the 001 for a horse is fairly close to 011 in the Hamming distance. It's only one binary digit away, while for the frog, you would keep them much further apart. So you would see that you need to basically flip 2 bits, not just one, to define to get your code from your frog. And now, when you want to inference, so when you want to infer those images at the inference time, you can calculate those 3 vectors. And important feature of the computation is that here, this recalculation does not depend on your data. It just depends on your index, so the I, which means that you can do it for all the past data. If you just enumerate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to, let's say, 100, you process 100 images, then you can recreate all the 99 previous vectors thanks to this formula. And you can use your decoder to decode those samples from the past. The definition of the function that gives you those binary codes is the following. So you have the index of your image, you have a p to the constant. So this is your parameter of your method, which defines you how big of the space you have, and then you modulate that and you generate the binary codes that are then assigned to a given class in the second stage of your training. Yeah, and the assignment works as I think elaborated a little bit in the past, so that you try to maximize the link, the similarity of your binary codes depending on what images you see. So the difference between the horses should be smaller than the difference between a horse and a frog. And this is the global autoencoder for all data batches. This is what it optimizes. Okay, and for the past data rehearsal, you take the indices of the previous samples from 1 to 6. Let's say that you're looking at the data sample number 7. You take this function that takes as index as an input, you create binary codes, you use your encoder to recreate your samples, and then you retrain your classifier with past data. And that's what gives you a fairly good results. This is the comparison with state of the art. What you see on the right side is that the table shows the improvement of our binplay methods versus competitive approaches based on generative replay, while on the qualitative side, you see that the quality of the samples that we generate, it is a little bit worse at batch 5 than it was at the original image, but it's still much better than what you get with the competitive approaches. So with the standard or the second best method, RTF, you see that just after the first batch, the quality of your reconstruction degrades significantly. And the reason is this latent overlap that I mentioned in the previous slides. Okay, but still, it's this research, so we're not done yet. There is a problem, obviously. The capacity of latent space is limited. And also, more importantly, the alignment of previous encodings is fixed for future batches. So the alignment is related to the binary codes. But for the future tasks, when you see more data, you would like to realign them more specifically. You would like to actually take this latent space of your binary codes and adjust the codes so that both the past data and the current data is actually provides you with a better quality of reconstructions. And this is why we look at the problem of latent space partitioning closer. And we propose a multiband variational autoencoder, which is again a generative replay method. But the continual learning problem in this case is set as a latent space knowledge accumulation task. So more specifically, we look at how latent space is built and what influences the location and the distribution of the latent points when you train on the next batches and the next data samples. So the clue for this method and the main intuition is that you effectively realign your per batch partitions. So in the past, in the previous slide, I think here I showed you that for binplay, the past, here, the past codes live in a specific part of your latent space, and you just populate the current batch a specific part of a new part of the latent space. Now, what we claim and what we focus on in multiband is that you are able to actually play with those alignments as you go and realign pair batch latent space partitions. Obviously, you want to make sure that those similarities between classes seen in specific batches is exploited. So if you look at the new data over here, 676, this is actually the overview of the method, but just look at the data and then latent space, which is here described or shown in red and green. So these are the latent spaces of the generative models. You look at 7, 6. In the past, you saw 6, but these were also mixed with the other digits. So what you want to have in your consolidated latent space is that even though the 6 was before encoded and seen, you would like to have this similarity between those classes even seen across different batches exploited. You would like to have the 6s together so that when you're resampling and reconstructing, you don't want to just move in your latent space by a few units in your latent space to the left or right, and then get, instead of 6, 5 or 3. You want to have some consistency in this latent space. And this is the idea behind multiband variational autoencoder. So this is a more specific overview with the elements of the method that play the most relevant role. You have a new task with new information. You have a local encoder with new samples encodings and a task code. You train your first latent space encoder and you add a translator. This is the novel part that we introduced that is responsible for creating this consolidated latent space. And then you have a global decoder that allows you to decode all the images from your latent space Z. So step by step, first we have a new knowledge acquisition part where you have a new task. It comes with some task code, and you create a encoder decoder architecture to create a latent space from which you could then sample and build your models, build your past data samples. Then you have the part where you learn a relationship between new and previous data samples. So you freeze your global decoder, and what you just train is the global translator. So you take the latent space and random samples from previous tasks, and you train this translator so that in the latent space, you find the right alignment where the classes, even seen across different batches, but classes are that are similar, they live in a small space or they live in a similar space. And then in the third place, in the third step, you consolidate this new and previous knowledge. So you train both global translator and global decoder. And this is the last part which aligns your latent space together. So how that looks in qualitative analysis, let's look at our baseline model, generative replay baseline model. So you just train a GAN or I think variational autoencoder in that case, task by task, and you have the first task with ones and zeros, and then in the second task you have zeros, and then in the third you add, I think, twos. So each task is depicted with a different color, and you visualize your space here with, I think, TC. So you have your first task ones and zeros, then in the second task you have zeros. Okay, they are fairly, aligned next to each other, but they are not separated. And those classes are actually close to, so you can actually go from 0 to 1. You can interpolate between those. And after 40 epochs, they get closer to each other. And then when the next task comes, they start to be completely all over the place. So you see 0 here, you see 0 here, you see 1, this, I don't know what it is, 2 you have here, but also here. As you see, the latent gets overlapped or messed up. And for multi-band variational autoencoder, we are explicitly modeling this space, and we look at ones and zeros after the first 2 tasks. Then after 40 epochs, you have, again, very well separated those 2 classes. And when the next task comes, the ones are aligned over here, and the twos create another part of your latent space. So you have still zeros outside, ones around here, and twos around here. And this is even if the samples are coming from different batches, but still with the same classes. And this gives us the results that are quite optimistic. We significantly reduced threshold inception distance, which is the metric that has to be, or it's better the less. So the fewer, the lower the number, the better the metric, while increasing the precision and recall of our generations. So the threshold inception distance measures the quality of your generations. The lower the metric, the better the quality. And we compared ourselves against the current state of the art, and the results showed very big improvement over those competing methods. Okay, we're slowly going towards the end, so I can just give you a brief advertisement about the recent grant that we got for this deep generative view on continual learning, and we have some scientific collaboration with international partners within this grant, and we are looking for a postdoc. So if any of you outside of eDrone, obviously, wants to create another path of career or is close to the end of a PhD, that's something that we can look at together. And if you're interested in this topic anyways, or you're looking at some interesting academic ideas, feel free to reach out to me, and we can definitely discuss the possibility of collaboration. So other projects that I'm personally involved in at the Warsaw University of Technology and the university in Krakow, Jagiellonian University, and Tooploox is the fast simulations of particle collisions at CERN. That's something I briefly described in the previous slide. This is the point is to speed up the simulations that are currently done using Monte Carlo by using GANs. So instead of going, through those many iterations of Monte Carlo, you are able to leverage generative models for this. The second project that is sponsored by Microsoft Research Cambridge is on low-shot realistic human rendering from partial information. And this is a small demo of what we were able to create so far. So the idea here is that you put the trajectories, these are those triangles, you just create them manually, and then humans or the joints that are visualizing human beings are automatically created to fill the scene. This is a useful rendering application for movies or for games where you don't want to animate every single frame of your video or game, but you just, again, draw a trajectory of a joint, and then the rest is done automatically with generative models. And then last but not least, our project on preterm birth prediction, we have a fairly good collaboration with medical universities, now opening with some research centers for detecting preterm birth, which is a significant problem, even though we are able to detect 2/3 of preterm birth using ultrasound images so far, but still 1/3 remains undetected. And what we do is we use machine learning and convolutional neural networks, UNets, and segmentation and classification heads to analyze the cervix, the parameters of the curvature, and predict whether a baby will be born prematurely, which is a good help for the doctors to prepare for the preterm birth, and then help the kid, the baby, and the mother with the active or fast recovery. And that's it from my side. Obviously, I'm just helping out with all of this work, but this is definitely the work most of the collaborators I work with, and especially my PhD students, Kamil, Monika, Kacper, and Wojtek, and some collaborators from both Tooploox and Jagiellonian University, and obviously Warsaw University of Technology. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you get a glimpse of what continual learning is, and I'm open for questions.
That's great, Tomek. That was really good. And yeah, we have a few questions there. They were submitted while you were talking, so I guess we may want to go back to some earlier slides. So the one from Manish, the first one is, I believe that was, perhaps we could give the microphone to Manish.
Sure. Manish, you are now allowed to talk, so you can precise your question if you want to.
Yeah. So thanks for a nice talk. But actually, I forgot some of the questions because I wrote it down during the slide. So I'll just ask 2 questions. So on slide 31, so so the distance measure is a Hamming distance in the latent space. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Right. Okay. So is it a good distance measure in the latent space, and what kind of space it is? I mean, so suppose, I need to think of an example where it does, you have to provide some measure, right? And you have an input and you do not know what's the value of the output corresponding to that measure. So if the measure is not right, it is going to fail somewhere, right? So if you understand the latent space correctly, then you have to prove that if the distance measure is the right distance measure. So
if I understand correctly, the question is the Hamming space, is the Hamming distance the right measure to analyze this latent space? Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually. So Hamming distance is traditionally used for binary spaces, and that's why it's kind of intuitive, because this is the closest what people usually think of in this space. But there are obviously other measures, like you can think about, I think in this case the Euclidean distance collapses with Hamming space, so this is the same, it will give you the same answer. With the cosine, maybe something different. We didn't actually investigate different metrics, and the reason for this is that the point of this latent space is not necessarily to retrieve your images from a given part of your latent space that are similar to each other, just to make sure that the images of classes that are different are split apart, so that the overlap is smaller.
So,
So
I mean,
in other words,
so if I understand correctly, what you're trying to do is you want to generate the distribution in the latent space. So suppose you have two sets of data which comes from two different distributions, right? Then you should have two distribution in the latent space, and you have to decide somehow that if the current input belongs to first distribution or the second distribution, right? So if the metric is not right, then that decision will be difficult one, right? As in, I mean, as you are showing in the slide 29, right?
Yeah, we don't need to decide whether the sample comes from this distribution or the other, because the generative model that we train is used to only create the samples. So what we need to be able to is create the codes, and that we can do, you know, offline. And then by sampling in the coding space, we just want to make sure that we are not getting the results that are not, well, they're mixture of two distributions. So it's not that much of an assignment of an image to a specific part of the latent space that is relevant in this specific application, but it is the splitting the distributions apart. They are related problems. I agree with this, but it's not the same. It's not the same issue as with retrieval. And in this case, what you're using, we're not actively optimizing towards maximizing coming distance. That's not this type of problem. What we're trying to make sure is that the overlap of two distributions is as small as possible.
Okay. And one more question, which you actually didn't discuss in the slides. So you talked about Monte Carlo simulation, and using machine learning, we can do it in a better way. So, I mean, could you describe a little bit more? Because
sure,
what I understand is you have to sample from the distribution, and how you're going to expedite it, because even for training, you need samples, right? So how
Sure. This is a different project. It's not related to continual learning per se, but we have the goal of this simulation work on machine on the collaboration with CERN is that how physical experiments are done in high energy physics is that there are certain assumptions about physical behavior of particles that follows the general laws of physics. And now the physicists construct the Monte Carlo simulations based on those general rules, and then look at they simulate many collisions of the particles. And what they do on the real side is that they run an experiment and they verify statistically if the distributions of the particles that result from those real experiments are the same. And if there is this...
Okay, I understand what you're trying to say. Basically, I mean, you are going to expedite using machine learning because you have already a trained model, and given a input statistics, you can identify if the particle belongs to the one we are looking for. Is that correct?
That's one of the applications, but here I'm not talking about particle identification. That's another discriminative problem. Here, what I'm trying to say is that Monte Carlo takes you as an input some parameters of the physical models, and as an output, it creates you the histograms, the statistical distribution of how the particles would collide with the detector. Okay. But this internal part is done by Monte Carlo. So you have to run a lot of iterations here. But the output is an image. So if you train a generative model that takes an input, the statistical, so it's conditioned on the statistical, on the physical parameters, and it gives you the histogram as an output, it doesn't really care what happens inside.
I mean, that's what I understand. I mean, that's what I was saying, that you have the input, and now since your weights are fixed, right, you can do away without a Monte Carlo simulation, and that will save time. Exactly.
I got it. Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.
You?
Okay, do we have any other questions? There is one from Grzegorz. Are generative models applicable to continual learning in NLP domain, natural language processing?
So generative model in NLP, I'm not a super expert in NLP, but I remember the discussions we had on GANs for the NLP solution or for the NLP problems. And I think that the main difference with images was related to the continuous space of intensities of pixels, while for NLP, you would actually have more discrete outputs. So at that point, I remember that GANs were not, they had to be tricked somehow to create the vector representation like word to vec, and then you can recreate the words out of this. So overall, I think that GPT-3 and all those methods, they are somehow related to generative modeling. At the end of the day, you condition them on the first phrases, and then you output the rest of the paragraph or so on. But honestly, I don't think, or I don't know at least enough to advertise on using generative models for NLP. Most of the methods that we work with are either continuous in the output space, or there are somehow can be tricked to be continuous in the output space. But the intrinsic problem with NLP, in fact, is that the discrete number of letters and outputs that you can create requires you to somehow go through these internal representations, like word to vec, like BERT, and so on. Once you go towards this part or this representation, and that's fairly easy to get from BERT to a word, then all the machinery inside can be applied in a fairly straightforward manner, probably with some usual tricks with NLP, which is like attention and transformers and all those modules. But that's my intuition. I don't think I'm expert enough to advise on that specifically.
So that's the one thing on your CV that is not there.
Yeah, no, I'm NLP user, heavy user, yeah. But I still need to. I look at NLP. Actually, it's a very interesting overlap between multimedia, NLP, audio, and vision. Even with audio, you have so much diversity. Like the signal is continuous. It's sound, so it's you can change a little bit the parameters and still get the same sound. In text, if you switch one letter to another, straight away it stops to be understandable. So the robustness of our brain to understand even misspells is much smaller than in images. In image, if you change one pixel by few percent, nobody cares. But if you change one letter, all of a sudden people are like, oh, you cannot write, you're misspelled that. It's very easily distinguishable. So yeah, that's my limitation. I will work on that, and next time I hope to give you a more educated answer.
Sure. Well, you have certainly advertised generative models well for solving that catastrophic forgetting problem. I was wondering, I think it was Vapnik who said many years ago that was a big proponent of discriminative models, that you should not attempt to solve the indirect problem of the distribution. Just go and try to directly solve the problem. So go for a discriminative approach. And I was wondering, in practice, when you're working with generative models, what kind of problems do you encounter? It sounds like it's arguably much more difficult to work with the full distribution as opposed to just trying to discriminate between the cases, right?
Yeah, no, it's a more tricky problem. That's why we first solved, ImageNet's classification problem, and then looked at generative models. Like historically, this is how it evolved. But just also wanted to mention that there are, I think, there in Q&A, there are a few other questions that we can take after this one. So to answer your comment, definitely it's a more tricky problem. What problems we encounter with generative models in real life is the training. So the training is for GAN specifically is much more tricky because you have like two networks, which means that you can iterate between them, or you need to iterate between them. And the balance between the how many iterations you can do here and there is not easy to be found. So it's something that comes with practice. So from like, I would say, stability perspective, these are more tricky models to play with. Second of all, it's very much more difficult than discriminative models to measure the performance of your generative models. It's still ongoing, like the battle. How do you verify if your generative model really works, especially for images? Like, right now we're looking at the distributions, comparing the distributions. This is how the first like log likelihood comparisons and so on. This is one way of looking at the problem. The second one is, and this is fresh at inception distance, you look at what are the responses of the inception net for the images generated by generative models and for the original ones. And you create yet another, proxy metrics to compare whether your generative model is provides you the quality that you want. Then you can look at additional classifiers. Let's say that you created a model that generates perfect images of cats and perfect images of dogs, and you train another classifier on top of this that allows you to detect between those two classes. If you are able to achieve a performance of, I don't know, 95% accuracy or precision, then you can say, okay, this is the good generative model. But if you think about it, internally, it's much easier to quantify the quality of your discriminative model versus your generative model, because, like, how do you assume, like, we are sort of wired to be able to generate or generalize as human beings much easier than other species. So if a kid draws a picture of like 4 lines and a circle, you would straight away know that this is a human being. Although it's not something that specifically looks like a human being, but our brain somehow automatically finds the links and then finds the patterns and analyzes, compares this, and so on and so far. So intuitively, I would say that it's much more difficult to quantify the quality of generative models. That's the second problem. First is the stability. Second is the quality evaluation. And the third one is the heaviness of those models. They are pretty heavy. Overall, like the discriminative models, we train them for years. Now we are able to reduce them into small snippets. For generative models, you still need the high quality for your generation to be realistic. And therefore you cannot get rid of those upsampling layers, which is what gives you the weight of your model.
Sure, thanks. So back to the questions. Well, actually, most of them are from Manish, and I think he asked them already.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the
From
one...
the chat, all questions are answered so far. So in the Q&A.
Yeah, the Q&A, there was a question about samples from the generators are fed over time to the new task classifier. I haven't fully understood. The samples from generative models trained on past batches. So let's say if you're training batch number 3, but you have a generator that was trained on batch number 1. At task 3, you feed both the current images, the images that you have as ground truth at hand, and the generations from the past batches. So you sort of repeat them from the past, and you mix them together. You just sample accordingly to well, the size of your batches and so on. So so that you rehearse them appropriately with the appropriate frequency. This is the idea. You sort of concatenate the data sets from the past and the current ones. I'm not sure if that answers the question because it's anonymous attendee, so it's hard for me to confirm with whoever asked this question, but I hope I answered that. There is a second, yeah. The second one is about the latent distribution in multiband variational autoencoder. So the latent distribution, if I remember correctly, I would probably need to look up in the paper, but I think it was Gaussian's. Let me try to quickly check that. It's variational autoencoder that we use, so that's why it's called multiband variational autoencoder. So if if I understand, yeah, it seems that it's the normal distribution, so it's a Gaussian, nothing fancy. Okay.
We have one from Arthur. So was any research done looking how to select the most effective samples to replay?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I didn't talk about that. We have some controlled forgetting mechanism in multiband variation autoencoder as well. But yes, this is very recent, or this is very active area of research. The way that we usually look at this problem is first just random uniform sampling, and this is no fancy selection. And the second thing that I think with a group at Tooploox we looked at was to find which elements of a given object, which parts of an image are relevant for the classification, and then focus on those parts and store those parts. That was another way. The idea here is that you can use many metrics to validate what means effective at a current stage. But the problem is that you don't know what the data is going to appear in the next batch. So what is effective right now can also change over time. And the evaluation of that is non-trivial, because what can be effective up to today to predict whether a cat is different from a dog can be completely useless when you see an airplane, for instance, because it doesn't have legs. So this kind of boils down to the problem of continual learning, and there are papers on that. It's controlled forgetting that we introduced in multiband, and I think there are a few others. But yeah, that's a very good question and a very good area to explore. And I think yeah.
So there's a second part there. Arthur asks if it's right assuming that the generative methods are superior to memory-based in terms of accuracy based on the presented results.
Yeah, so for this, I would say you're talking probably about this last slide that I presented. I would say that this is a little bit well, unfair for some, in some sense.
Overstated.
Yeah. You can think about this from a multiple perspective. That's why these are papers. So obviously we need to sell them as well as we can. The accuracy wise, they are better. The question is, what assumptions do you make on the size of those models? Because if you compare like a smart method for keeping only the relevant data from the past and replaying this data, and compare the size of this with the size of multiple generative models that you need to build, then I'm afraid it's not going to be that well bright for generative models. What I personally believe is that the comparison with memory buffer is short-sighted, because obviously memory buffer is something that you have a fairly, whatever the size of your memory, it's still limited. In generative modeling, you look at a different problem. You're looking at the problem of representation learning. And that's why you're still bounded by memory, but the idea is a little bit different. You look at how to effectively represent your data. And this is not, I mean, I'm pretty sure that the most effective representation of images that you as a person saw in your life is a memory buffer, because this way we would need our brains to grow, evolutionary with every single day that we look at the surrounding world, and that's not the case. So somehow evolution did not program us to store every single image that we saw in our life, but it programmed us to learn to create representations, internal representations of objects, so that we are able to regenerate them from our memory, or at least map them to this associative memory. And these are like, I highly encourage you to look at this from a broader perspective. That's why I like continual learning so much, because it allows me to explore, behavioral economics and Kahneman's book and neuroinformatics. It's a very diverse problem, and it draws a lot of inspiration from other sciences. So for the time being, I would say that memory buffer would still work, because we have a toy samples and the size of those data sets are manageable. But in the long run, I believe that that's not the solution for continual learning problem.
Thank you. And we've got a final question, which actually might have been partially answered. It's about NLP again. So do you know any applications of continual learning in NLP?
No, but I think that in NLP, if I have to think about some applications, I would probably look at translation or sentiment analysis or classification kind of models. And then it's pretty much the same problem. Like, let's say that you want to classify a sentiment of a data set coming from Twitter, and then you want to learn how to use, let's say, data from Facebook to do it again, but not by putting everything together. And even at that point, you would need to normalize the data and so on. So it's not that straightforward. In the translation, on the other hand, like if you want to, let's say, train a model on French, and then use this knowledge to get the translation for Spanish, for instance. You know that there are some intrinsic similarities between those two languages, because they come from the Latin language family. But if you would like to use this knowledge and save for the computations, or even improve your translation, that's not that straightforward. Like, you'd probably need to play a little bit so that the model translates both for Spanish and French. And I think right now the solution would be to have two specific or two separate models. So these would be my, I would say, go-to applications if I want to apply or write a paper for the NLP community. But I think it kind of evolved more from the machine learning community, and that's why images are always the first ones to grab, because they're just visually pleasing, and it's fairly easy to define the problems with images if you see ones. Thank you for the question.
Okay, I believe that was the final one, and I think we are running out of time. Tomasz, it was an honor to have you here on our little show today, and certainly very inspiring topic, and thanks for all the detailed answers, and well, looking forward to talking to you again.
Thanks so much for hosting me again, and for the warm intro, and for all the questions. It was really a pleasure. Thanks a lot, and have a good rest of the day, guys, and stay hydrated.
Well, thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.